Why was she the only one still standing when everyone else looked away? The pilot's briefing room was never quiet. Not when an alarm was still echoing in your bones. Not when the air reeked of stale coffee and cold fear. Yet, in that moment, as Captain Riley Thompson stood at the back of the room, the noise faded into something else entirely. She could hear it, that familiar, low hum of judgment that seemed to follow her through every hallway in the Army. They told her in whispers and in smirks that women weren't built for combat flying, that she was here because someone in the Pentagon had decided the Army needed to show progress, that the real warriors flew with heavier hands and broader shoulders. She'd heard it so many times she stopped trying to fight it, not because she believed them, but because she knew the only way to silence a prejudice that old was to do the job better than anyone else. And never once flinch. Today would test that more than she'd ever imagined. It started at 0547 hours. The base was just waking up, lights still flickering on in barracks windows, the low groan of machinery stirring to life, the sky still clinging to the last shade of night. Riley had been awake for over an hour already, her morning ritual unbroken. Coffee, weather reports, mechanical checks. She liked routine. It gave her hands something to do while her mind stayed ready. Then the klaxon screamed. It was the kind of alarm that didn't care about your coffee or your checklist. It cut straight into your ribs. The intercom voice followed, clipped and urgent. All pilots to the briefing room immediately. This is not a drill. She didn't need the reminder. You could hear the difference in a voice like that. The kind of urgency that didn't leave room for optimism. She was running before the words had finished echoing. When she reached the room, the air was thick with adrenaline. 12 pilots ringed a glowing tactical display. Satellite images flickered under their eyes. Colonel Marcus Hayes stood in front of them, shoulders squared, jaw locked. The man had flown more hours in combat than most of them had been alive. But this morning, he looked like someone had drained 10 years out of him overnight. At 0430 hours, he began. Bravo Battalion was conducting a routine patrol near the contested zone. They walked straight into the largest enemy ambush we've seen in 5 years. 500 soldiers pinned in a valley. No ground-based extraction possible. The words landed like stones in water. Heavy, rippling. Riley's eyes locked on the map. The valley was tight, high ridges curling in like a fist. She could already imagine what it felt like to be on the ground there. Nowhere to run. Every direction uphill and hostile. Hayes went on. Enemy has surface-to-air missiles in the surrounding hills. We've lost 2 Chinooks and a Black Hawk in the last 90 minutes trying to reach them. Weather's deteriorating. Storm front. Moving in. We've got 4 hours before the sky closes entirely. Captain Jake Morrison raised a hand. Sir, with respect, this sounds like an Air Force job. We can't get close enough with those SAMs active. Hayes shook his head. Bombers can't help. Civilians too close. This extraction has to be precise, and it has to be now. Riley listened to the murmured calculations. The pilot's voice is low but tense. Every route into the valley was a death sentence on paper. SAM coverage overlapped like spider webs. Flying in would be threading a needle through a storm. 1 missile, 1 lucky RPG, and you'd never make it out. Hayes' voice cut the debate short. I need volunteers. I will not order anyone to fly this. Odds of survival are minimal. Silence. It wasn't the pause before someone stepped forward. It was the pause when no one wanted to be the first to say no. Riley could feel it, that tight, cold weight in the air, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to break it. Her own heartbeat was loud in her ears. This is what they've always believed about you, that you'll blink first, that you'll protect yourself. She didn't. I'll take it. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough. 12 heads turned toward her. A couple of brows lifted. Morrison laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. Come on, Riley. This isn't a training run. 500 lives under heavy fire. You think I'm aware of what it is. Her tone was steady, not cold, but immovable. Brad Collins leaned back in his chair, smirking like he'd been waiting for this. Look, sweetheart. The word landed exactly how he meant it to, like an insult wrapped in honey. This needs someone who can handle pressure. Someone who won't freeze up when the missiles start flying. Maybe stick to transports. The heat rose in her chest, but she'd long since stopped letting it spill over. My flight records speak for themselves. More combat hours than anyone here except Colonel Hayes. Flying supplies, Morrison. Cut in. Not extraction under fire. Hayes' eyes flicked to her. You understand the risks, Thompson? This isn't dangerous. It's likely one way. She stepped closer to the display, scanning terrain like a surgeon studying an X-ray. Northern Route's heavy SAM coverage, but best LG. Southern's longer, less coverage, but slower. Eastern's suicide. We go nap of the Earth under 50 feet until the final approach. Countermeasures give us a fighting chance against shoulder-fired missiles. And when you get there. Morrison's voice was edged. How do you plan to pull out 500 soldiers with one Apache? Multiple trips, strip non-essentials, carry. 8 at a time. Land, load, get out, repeat. Collins scoffed. 60 trips? You think they'll just let you keep coming back? Then I'd better fly fast. The room buzzed with disbelief. Some called it insane. Others didn't bother giving it a name. But no one, not one, stepped forward to take it from her. Hayes. Let the silence stretch before nodding. Thompson. Immediate departure, Apache 77 Alpha. Newest countermeasures. Max ammunition. Call sign. Guardian Angel. She nodded once, behind her. She heard Morrison mutter, she'll be dead in 20 minutes. She paused in the doorway. Captain Morrison, when I bring them home, I expect a public apology. Acceptable. He smirked. Sweetheart, if you pull this off, I'll recommend you for the Medal of Honor. I'll hold you to it. The flight line was alive with movement. Ground crews swarming Apache 77 Alpha with NASCAR urgency. The air smelled of fuel and ozone. Her pre-flight checks were muscle memory. Her mind already in the valley, mapping every shadow, every ridge. Chief Warrant Officer Maria Santos appeared at her elbow, helmet under one arm. Ma'am, respectfully, I'd like to fly this with you. Riley's first instinct was no. Santos was young, barely 25, with a baby at home. But her eyes were steady, her jaw set. If you're making multiple runs, you need someone on comms, nav, and weapons. You can't do this alone. Riley gave the smallest nod. Strap in. The engine screamed to life, vibrations moving through her bones. This machine was an extension of her, a part of her that didn't doubt, didn't flinch. Guardian Angel, Tower. Cleared immediate departure. Weather window closing. Copy, Riley said. Eyes forward. Beginning departure sequence. They lifted, dropped low, and stayed there, skimming the ground at 150 miles per hour, fast enough to blur the world into streaks of green and brown. Santos monitored the battalion's desperate transmissions. Low ammo, dozens wounded. Enemy massing for final assault. Guardian Angel, Bravo 6. The voice cracked over static. ETA? 10 minutes walking wounded first, multiple trips. The pause was telling. Multiple trips? LZ's already. Taken 3 birds. Recommend abort. Negative. Bravo 6. Inbound. The first missiles came without warning. Just smoke trails slicing the air. Santos shouted. Missiles inbound. Riley's hands in the machine moved as one. Hard left brake. G-forces pressing her deep into the seat. Chaff and flares streaked past the canopy. She dropped into a canyon so narrow the rotors had 10 feet clearance on each side. The missiles slammed into rock instead of steel. That's why we fly low, she muttered. The valley opened ahead. Fire. Smoke. Chaos. Purple smoke marked the LZ. Enemy guns shifted, their fire thickening toward the clearing. Santos, Eastern Ridge Suppression. The chain gun roared, precise bursts ripping through enemy nests. Riley slammed the Apache down. In a combat landing, dust swallowing them, 8 men, wounded, bleeding, were shoved aboard in under a minute. Then they were gone again, skimming ground, the valley shrinking behind them at base. She didn't shut down the engines. Fuel. Ammo fast as you can, ma'am. Maybe take a break. Fuel, ammo, 492 still out there. 12 minutes later, they were airborne again, and again, and again. But the weather was turning, and so was the enemy. She didn't care. She hadn't taken this mission to prove a point. She'd taken it because 500 soldiers were waiting for someone to do the impossible, and she'd decided impossible was just another word for untested, and she wasn't about to blink first. How many times could you gamble with your life before the odds stopped pretending to be in your favor? Riley didn't have an exact number in mind. She only knew she hadn't reached it yet. The second run began with a shift in the air. Not the kind you could see on radar, but the kind you could feel in your teeth. Enemy gunners had learned from the first pass. The moment Apache 77 Alpha crested the ridge, the LZ lit up with fire that felt denser, hotter. They weren't trying to force her away. They were trying to end her. She used the terrain differently this time, hugging the shoulder of a ridgeline, letting it block enemy sight lines until the very last second. Santos kept her voice calm, calling out targets, toggling weapons with practiced precision. The soldiers were ready this time. No hesitation, no confusion. 8 men sprinted toward the helicopter the instant its skids hit dirt. Their comrades kept up a wall of covering fire, brass casings piling in the mud. 45 seconds. That's all it took to load. They were back in the air before the enemy could adjust. Riley could feel the rounds snapping past the fuselage, the low metallic thunks of impacts absorbed by armor plating. Back at base, it was the same drill. Fuel, ammo, no shutdown. The crew chief's face was drawn tight. "Ma'am, you've got hits along the fuselage. No penetration yet, but no yet." Riley cut in. "Top it off. We're going again." The third run nearly didn't happen. Halfway in, they took a burst from a heavy machine gun that stitched across the side of the bird. Warning lights flared in the cockpit. One engine shuddered. Not enough to fail, but enough to make her hands grip the controls tighter. "Hydraulics are acting up," Santos reported. "Backup systems? They're compensating for now." She kept flying on the fourth run. An RPG detonated close enough to slap the helicopter sideways. The blast cracked the cockpit glass. Spiderweb lines racing across her peripheral vision. On the fifth, she landed under direct mortar fire, the ground shaking with each incoming round. The soldiers loaded faster than she'd seen anyone move. No one wanted to be in that clearing longer than a heartbeat. The sixth trip was the first time she saw Santos bleed. Shrapnel punched through armor plating, carving a line along the younger woman's arm. "I'm fine," Santos insisted, tightening her harness one-handed. "Keep flying." Riley didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because she couldn't afford to slow. By the 10th run, they'd pulled out 80 soldiers. By the 20th, 160. Every trip felt heavier, not from the men they carried, but from the way the enemy adapted. Machine gun nests shifted. RPG teams rotated in fresh. The SAM sights seemed to creep closer to the LZ with each pass. Her hands hurt from gripping the cyclic and collective so tightly. Her eyes burned from staring through the cracked canopy, never blinking long enough for fatigue to catch her. On the 25th run, the odds finally took their shot. The missile came from nowhere. No smoke trail, no radar warning, just an impact that tore through the tail section like it was paper. The Apache bucked, the nose jerking violently as the tail rotor disintegrated. The cockpit went instantly loud. Alarms. Rattling metal, the howl of wind. The world outside tilted, spun, Blurred. Mayday. Mayday. Santos called, her voice sharp. Guardian Angel is going down. Riley didn't answer. Her mind was a tight loop of muscle memory and instinct. Without the tail rotor, the fuselage spun like an unbalanced top. She fought with every ounce of strength, using the main rotor's cyclic to bleed off spin, coaxing the aircraft into something that resembled control. Hold on. They hit hard, the kind of landing you don't walk away from by accident. Metal screamed against dirt and rock, the bird bouncing once before tipping onto its side. Silence followed, a dangerous kind, the kind that meant your brain was still, deciding if it wanted to stay conscious. Riley's harness kept her from falling sideways. Her ears rang. She turned her head. Santos was slumped in her seat, blood on her temple. Maria. Riley unbuckled, leaning over. Pulse. Strong. Breathing. Shallow, but steady. The radio crackled. Guardian Angel, Bravo 6. We saw you go down, Can. You respond? She keyed the mic. Bravo 6. We're alive. Birds down. Continue holding position. I'm coming to you on foot. Negative, Guardian Angel. Too dangerous. We'll send a squad. You can't spare them. How many? Still in position? A pause. 298. 298 men who'd watched her come and go like a lifeline all morning. 298 who were now watching the storm build over the valley. Riley looked at the wreckage. The tail rotor was gone. Completely, but the engine still looked functional. The main rotor wasn't bent. It would be like trying to fly a washing machine, but maybe, just maybe, it was possible. She'd read about pilots in Vietnam doing it. It took constant corrections, the kind of flying that shredded your muscles and your nerves. Most didn't. Survived the attempt, but most pilots weren't her. Santos groaned, eyes fluttering open. What happened? Missile, we're down. I think I can fly her without the tail rotor. That's impossible, Santos muttered. The torque will spin us apart. For most people. She began the startup sequence. The engines roared to life. The moment. The skids lifted. The aircraft tried to spin. She fought it. Muscles burning, wrists aching, forcing the rotor disc to counter the torque with unnatural precision. Somehow, the ground fell away. Guardian Angel, Bravo 6, came the incredulous. Voiceover comes. Are you actually flying that thing? Affirmative, inbound, have 8 ready. When she landed, the soldiers stared like they were watching a ghost. 8 piled in. The flight back was the longest 15 minutes of her life. The helicopter bucking, fighting her hands every second, but it stayed in the air, at base. The crew chief ran to meet them, eyes wide. Ma'am, this bird shouldn't be able to fly. Then it's a good thing we're not asking permission, Riley said. Fuel ammo. No tail rotor, no parts to fix it. Then we fly. Without it, she looked at Santos. How's the arm? Hurts like hell. I can still run weapons. Good. We've got 290 more to get. The ground crew stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had, but the storm was rolling in fast, and she wasn't about to let weather or physics tell her when to quit. How many times could you push your body past its limits before it stopped answering? The first run after the crash felt like flying inside a nightmare. Every vibration in the crippled Apache was sharper now, the spin always threatening to break. Free from her control, the tail rotor's absence meant every input was a fight. Her forearms aching from the constant pressure. She could already feel the burn setting in, the slow tightening of muscles that wouldn't get the rest they needed. Until this was over. If it was ever over. Wind's picking up, Santos said overcomes, eyes flicking between her weapon displays and the growing wall of dark clouds in the distance. It's coming faster than forecast. Riley didn't answer. She'd been watching it too. The storm was like a second enemy. No malice, no intent. Just an indifferent wall that would end them all the same. They skimmed the ridges into the valley again, rotor wash bending the treetops. The landing zone came into view, smaller now It seemed more choked with debris and shell craters than before. Enemy tracers crisscrossed the air like angry veins of light. The soldiers on the ground knew what to do. 8 men loaded with the speed of desperation. They were gone in less than 40 seconds. The return flight was worse than the approach. The wind buffeted them sideways. Fighting against every correction Riley made to keep the spin in check, she landed hard at base, the skids groaning under the impact. She didn't even remove her hands from the controls. "Fuel, ammo, go." The crew chief hesitated. "Ma'am, you can't keep—" "I can." Her voice left no room for argument. The 11th trip started with a near miss. A SAM screamed up from behind a tree line. So close Riley felt the heat through the cockpit glass, Santos had already dropped flares. But it wasn't the countermeasures that saved them. It was the way she threw the helicopter into a roll that pressed them against their seats before snapping it level again. Jesus, Santos breathed, half in awe, half in disbelief. "Don't thank me yet." Trip 12. They landed under heavy mortar fire. Dirt and shrapnel pelted the Apache, rattling against the cracked canopy like hail. One soldier stumbled. As he boarded, blood soaking his side, Santos reached back, dragging him into the compartment before slamming the hatch closed. Trip 13. An RPG detonated mid-air just yards from the cockpit. The shockwave slammed into them so hard Riley thought for a moment they'd lost the main rotor. Warning lights flashed, then steadied. They kept going. Trip 15. Her headset crackled with interference. "Guardian Angel, we've got enemy movement toward the LZ from the north. They're bringing in heavier weapons." "Copy," Riley said, already recalculating her approach vector in her head. She came in from the opposite direction, weaving through terrain so low that the treetops slapped the skids. The soldiers at the LZ didn't question it. They just ran for the bird and piled in. By trip 17, Riley's flight suit was soaked through with sweat. Her hands ached, every knuckle stiff. The muscles in her shoulders and back were locked tight from fighting the spin. Santos noticed. "You need water, at least a break." Riley shook her head. "We're down to hours, maybe less." Trip 19. The first real close call. As they lifted off, a lucky burst from a machine gun hit one of the ammo belts on board. The compartment filled with the acrid smell of burnt powder as Santos kicked it clear, the damaged rounds clattering into the mud below. Trip 22. The storm began to show its teeth. Sheets of rain streaked across the canopy, the visibility narrowing to a smear of gray and shadow. It made the valley even more dangerous. The enemy fire was harder to see until it was almost on them. "You can't land in this much longer," Santos warned. "I'll land until I can't." Trip 24. A bullet ricocheted inside the cockpit, missing Riley's helmet by less than an inch. She didn't even flinch. The focus had narrowed too far for anything else to get in. On the 30th trip, they were both beyond tired. The movements were still precise, still deadly efficient, but they'd become automatic. They didn't talk much anymore. There was nothing to say that wasn't already understood. Enemy forces had shifted again. More RPG teams, more concentrated fire at the LZ. The soldiers on the ground were down to the last of their ammunition. Riley could hear it in their comms. Short, clipped calls, no wasted words. Trip 31. The damage got worse as they lifted off. A round tore through one of the main rotor blades, sending a deep, rhythmic vibration through the frame. It was the kind of damage that could turn catastrophic without warning. "We should ground her," Santos said. But it was half-hearted. They both knew she wouldn't. Trip 33. The wind was strong enough to shove the Apache sideways during landing. Riley compensated, setting the bird down in a space barely big enough to fit, rotor tips clearing the ridgeline by maybe 2 feet. The soldiers boarding didn't see the calculation. They just saw the helicopter that kept coming back. Trip 35 was the worst yet. The approach vector they'd been using all afternoon was finally compromised. An RPG streaked past just as they crossed the ridge. forcing Riley into a snap roll and dive that took them dangerously close to the treetops. "Never doing that again," Santos muttered, but they both knew they'd do it as many times as it worked. The storm was closing now, fast enough that you could see the sheets of rain bending sideways in the wind. The horizon was a wall of darkness, lightning flashing inside it like some distant, silent war as they lifted from the 36th trip. Riley's hands felt like they belonged to someone else. Slow, heavy, detached. Her mind was still locked in, but her body was running on fumes. "How many left?" she asked. Santos checked the tally. 8 more trips, maybe 9. Riley didn't nod, didn't sigh, just turned the Apache back toward the valley. They weren't done yet. How do you keep flying when the sky itself is trying to throw you out of it? By the 37th trip, the storm had stopped being a threat in the distance and had become something alive, wrapping itself around the valley like a predator closing in. The rain was no longer a patter. It was a hammer. Each drop hit the canopy with a sharp, rattling impact. The wind shoved at the Apache like a giant hand, fighting her every turn, every climb. Even the sound inside the cockpit had changed. The rain and rotor wash fusing into a deep, chaotic roar. Visibility's down to maybe 50 yards. "Santos said, her voice steady but tight. "We're flying blind out here." "Not blind," Riley answered, eyes locked on the blurred green and brown smears of terrain whipping past below. "Just squinting." Santos didn't laugh. There wasn't enough room for humor anymore. The LZ looked different every time now. Crater deeper, smoke thicker. The purple marker smoke a weak flag in the chaos. The soldiers waiting to board were wet, muddy, faces streaked with exhaustion and gunpowder. The 8 who clambered into the compartment barely glanced at Riley or Santos. Gratitude was there, unspoken, but survival didn't leave space for ceremony. The takeoff was harder than the landing. The wind shifted mid-lift, trying to tip them. Riley compensated instantly, muscles straining to keep the crippled bird level. The moment they cleared the ridge, lightning flashed close enough to make her flinch. The cockpit bathed in white for a heartbeat. Back at base, the ground crew was moving with the speed of people who understood they were down to minutes, not hours. Fuel, ammo, no questions, no advice, just action. Trip 38 came with an unwelcome surprise. The enemy had pulled in more heavy weapons from the north. Santos spotted them first. "Multiple heat signatures on the ridge," she said. "Bigger caliber. They're digging in." "They'll be in range by the next trip," Riley said, already adjusting her mental map. The landing was short and violent. Straight down, skids biting into the mud. 8 more in, hatch shut, and they were gone. The ridge to the north lit up as they climbed, tracer fire slicing through the rain. Trip 39. Riley came in low from a different vector, swinging wide around the ridge and threading through a canyon so narrow the rotor tips were less than 3 feet from the rock. Santos didn't speak. There was no time for commentary when a half-second miscalculation could shear a blade clean off. By the time they reached base again, the storm had turned the ground into mud thick enough to pull at the skids. The crew chief had to wave in a fuel truck through ankle-deep water. "How many left?" Riley asked over the comms. 110. Came the reply from Bravo 6. 14 more trips, trip 40. The wind hit them from the side, so hard on approach that Riley had to angle the bird 30 degrees into it just to stay on course. Her shoulders burned from the constant corrections. The 8 soldiers who boarded barely had time to secure themselves before she was lifting off again. Skimming the treetops back toward base, by trip 43, she'd lost count of how many times they'd been fired on. It didn't matter anymore. It all blended into a constant rhythm. Land, load, lift, dodge, land again, trip 45. Nearly broke that rhythm. They were on final approach when a SAM locked on. The warning tone in the cockpit was a piercing, insistent beep. Santos dropped flares instantly. But the missile kept coming, threading through the false targets like it knew exactly who it wanted. "Hold on," Riley said, voice flat. She pulled a maneuver no sane pilot would attempt with a fully functional aircraft, let alone one missing a tail rotor. A steep, rolling dive that turned into a climb so sudden that G-forces pressed the breath from their lungs. The missile streaked past the canopy, missing by less than 20 feet before detonating in a fireball that rattled the Apache. Santos exhaled slowly, almost a laugh. "I'm never telling anyone you did that." Good. They wouldn't believe it. At base, the medics were working on a growing line of wounded pulled from the valley. The triage zone had turned into a muddy sprawl of tents and stretchers under floodlights, shadows swaying in the wind. Riley barely looked at it. She couldn't afford to trip 47. One of the main rotor blades took another hit. The vibration was worse now, a deep shudder that made the entire frame feel unstable. "Still holding?" Santos asked, glancing at the gauges. For now, trip 48. The rain was so heavy that the soldiers waiting at the LZ were just dark shapes until they were less than 30 yards away. The wind whipped the purple smoke in ragged spirals. Trip 49. A bullet hit the canopy glass dead on. It didn't penetrate, but the force of it made the crack in the corner grow. Spidering another inch toward her line of sight by trip 50, the exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. Her hands ached so badly she could feel each individual joint protesting every correction. Her forearms were tight knots of pain. Her voice, when she spoke to Santos or over the comms, was a little lower now, deliberate. Conserving breath, trip 51 was when Bravo 6 called in with a warning Riley didn't need. "Guardian Angel, the enemy is concentrating everything. They've got on the LZ now. They know you're coming back for the last of us." "Copy," Riley said. "We'll be there." Trip 52, she switched vectors again, this time taking them in from the southeast. Skimming so low they startled a herd of goats that scattered across the hillside. Trip 53, the cockpit filled with the smell of burning insulation. A wire somewhere in the belly of the Apache had taken a hit. Santos checked the systems, confirmed nothing critical had failed yet. Trip 54. She landed in mud so deep it tried to hold the skids. The soldiers had to push off the ground to help the helicopter lift clear. Trip 55. They took fire so heavy on takeoff that Santos ran the gun nearly dry, suppressing it. By the time they reached base, they were down to a handful of high explosive rounds. "How many left?" Riley asked. 34, Bravo 6 replied. 4 more trips. The storm was almost on top of them now. The light had gone gray and flat, every shadow swallowed by the downpour. The wind was a constant shove. Trip 56, she came in under such heavy fire that she had to keep the helicopter moving, even as soldiers boarded. A dangerous rolling pickup that left no margin for error. Trip 57, the enemy nearly got her. A burst from a mounted gun hit the fuselage inches from the fuel line. Santos swore under her breath as they lifted, both of them knowing how close that had been. Trip 58 was the quietest approach of the day. No fire until the moment they touched down, when all at once it came from every direction. Trip 59, the second to last. The cockpit was vibrating so badly from rotor damage that her vision blurred. She kept flying anyway. Back at base, as the last 8 soldiers were unloaded, the crew chief leaned into the cockpit. "Ma'am, you've got 1 trip left in her before she comes apart. 1 trip's all I need." Riley said. She didn't even look at Santos. They both knew. This was it, the final run. What if your last flight really was your last? That thought sat in the back of Riley's mind as she lifted off for trip 60. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was more like the quiet understanding that this bird was 1 flight away from falling apart in the air, and she was about to ask it to do exactly that. The rain was relentless now, thick and slanted, driven by a wind that seemed determined to push her back toward the base. Lightning cracked somewhere close enough that she felt it in her teeth. The clouds were low and bruised, and the world beyond the cockpit had narrowed to shades of gray, broken only by the blur of trees rushing beneath them. Santa's voice cut through the noise. Final approach vectors compromised. They've moved more heavy weapons into the northern ridge. We can't go that way. Then we don't, Riley said, eyes already tracing a different path through the terrain in her mind. She chose the longest route in, looping around to come up through a river gorge that twisted like a spine. It would give them cover until the very last second, but it would also mean less time in the LZ before the enemy found their range. The gorge was narrow, the walls closing in on either side. The rotor tips seemed to graze the rock. Every push of the wind threatened to shove them sideways into the stone. Riley kept them centered, hands steady, jaw clenched. When they burst out of the gorge, the LZ was directly ahead, and it was worse than she'd imagined. The ground was torn to pieces by shellfire, cratered and muddy. The smoke from earlier battles mixed with the rain to create a thick, choking mist. The last soldiers, 34 of them, were spread thin, firing from makeshift positions against an enemy that was pressing in from three sides. And when the Apache appeared, the enemy fire shifted instantly toward it. Contact, multiple positions. Santos called, swinging the chain gun toward the eastern ridge. Her bursts were precise, short, conserving every round they had left. Make it count, Riley said. She brought the helicopter down hard, skids sinking into the wet ground. The soldiers were moving before they'd even fully landed, two at a time into the compartment, hands gripping whatever they could in the cramped space. Mud clung to boots, uniforms, faces. One man stumbled, blood streaming down his leg, and another soldier hauled him up by his vest. 6 loaded, Santos reported. The 7th was halfway. And when the first RPG hit nearby, the blast slammed into the side of the Apache, shoving it sideways in the mud. Riley fought the controls, keeping the bird level. Get him in now. The last man dove through the hatch just as another burst from a heavy gun chewed across the ground where he'd been standing. 8! Santos called. Riley lifted instantly, the rotor wash throwing mud in every direction. The Apache bucked. The damage from the rotor blade hit earlier had worsened, the vibration now a violent shudder. As they climbed out, enemy fire was constant. Tracers whipped past the canopy, some so close Riley thought she could reach out and touch them. She weaved through it, skimming low across the valley floor, using every rise in the terrain for cover. Then the SAMLOC warning blared. Missile! Santos shouted. Riley didn't bother with flares. The wind was so erratic they'd be useless. Instead, she threw the helicopter into a sudden drop, nose down, diving toward the river below. The missile followed, streaking after them like a burning spear. At the last second, she yanked the nose up and rolled hard to the right, skimming the surface of the river so close that water sprayed the underside of the fuselage. The missile overshot, slamming into the canyon wall ahead in a flash of fire and rock. They were still shaking from the near miss when the wind hit them again, pushing them dangerously close to the treetops. Riley corrected, jaw locked, every muscle in her arms screaming from the effort of keeping the crippled Apache in the air. 5 minutes to base, Santos said, her voice low. 5 minutes. Riley echoed. The rain thickened, blurring everything into streaks. The world narrowed to the glowing instruments in front of her, and a sense of the ground rushing below. Every now and then lightning flashed, throwing the inside of the cockpit into stark white light. At one point, a gust caught them so hard. The helicopter tilted violently to the left. Riley corrected immediately, skids brushing the treetops before she could pull them back into level flight. The closer they got to base, the more the storm seemed to want to hold them back, the wind shifting, The rain lashing harder, every second a fight, when the base perimeter finally broke through the haze. It didn't feel like a victory yet. She still had to set the bird down without letting it tear itself apart. The landing was brutal, a bone-deep thud as the skids hit mud and slid before catching. The Apache leaned dangerously, the damaged rotor whining under the strain, but it stayed upright. "Clear!" Santos shouted, and the last 8 soldiers spilled out into the waiting arms of medics and MPs. Only then did Riley let her hands ease from the controls. They were stiff, uncooperative. As if they'd forgotten how to not fly, she sat back for a second, letting the sound of the engines fill the cockpit. "You did it," Santos said quietly, almost as if she didn't want to break whatever held the moment together. Riley didn't answer right away. She watched through the rain-smeared glass as the last of the soldiers disappeared into the med tents, the line of stretchers growing longer. Then she reached up and began shutting down the engines. The roar faded, replaced by the sound of the storm. Wind through the rotor blades, rain on metal. For the first time all day, the Apache was still. They had all made it out, every single one. But Riley wasn't thinking about the number. She was thinking about the moments in between, the way the soldiers' faces changed the second they saw the helicopter breaking through the rain, the weight of their boots on the skids, the way Santos' hands never shook, even when everything else around them did. She unbuckled her harness, feeling the ache in her shoulders, her back, her arms. Every muscle was one knot of pain. When she stepped out into the rain, the crew chief was waiting. He didn't speak at first, just looked at the helicopter, like he was trying to understand how it had survived what he'd just watched. "Ma'am," he said finally, "that's the most beat-to-hell bird I've ever seen still in one piece." "Not much left to her," Riley agreed, "but she got 'em all home." Riley didn't smile, didn't nod. She just looked back at the Apache, the rain dripping from its battered frame, the cracked canopy, the scorched tail section where the rotor should have been. It didn't look like much, but it had done more than anyone had thought possible, and so had she. What happens when the noise finally stops? For Riley, it was almost disorienting. The storm was still roaring outside, wind slapping rain against every wall of the hangar. But compared to the cockpit, the constant alarms, the snap of gunfire, the thud of impacts against armor, it felt like the world had been turned down to half volume. She sat on the edge of a metal bench just inside the hangar doors, helmet in her lap, the Apache visible beyond her in the downpour. The bird looked worse than she'd expected from the inside. The cracked canopy was spidered almost to the frame. The tail section blackened from the missile hit. One rotor blade warped so badly it hung lower than the others. Someone had set a steaming mug of coffee on the bench beside her. She didn't remember who. She didn't drink it. Her hands were still stiff, fingers reluctant to curl after hours locked on the cyclic and collective. She flexed them slowly, each movement a reminder of how long she'd been fighting the spin without the tail rotor. The hangar was busy, medics moving in and out, voices on radios, the clank of tools as ground crews assessed the damage. But every so often, someone's eyes would slide her way. Not long stares, just quick, measuring glances. She knew what they were thinking. She came back. She didn't feel like celebrating. She felt hollow, like the adrenaline had drained out all at once, leaving only the weight of the last 11 hours pressing down on her. Santos limped in from the med tent, a fresh bandage on her arm. She dropped onto the bench beside Riley without asking. They sat in silence for a while, watching the rain sheet down over the open hangar mouth. "How's the arm?" Riley asked finally. "Doc says it's fine. Just deep enough to make laundry hell." Riley almost smiled. "You flew through worse." "You flew through worse," Santos corrected. "I just sat there and pulled triggers. That's not all you did." They let that hang in the air. Some things didn't need to be argued about. Not tonight. Colonel Hayes appeared in the doorway, water streaming off his cap and shoulders. He stepped inside, eyes going straight to Riley. "Captain Thompson," he said, voice even. "On behalf of the United States Army, I want to thank you for the most extraordinary display of courage and skill I've ever witnessed." Riley stood, more out of reflex than anything else. "Sir, I was just doing my job." Hayes shook his head. "No, you did far more than your job. You redefined it." Behind him, other officers were filtering in a pair of Washington uniforms she didn't recognize. All sharp creases and dry boots, the kind that hadn't been near the mud today. One stepped forward, a woman with the kind of presence that made you stand straighter without realizing it. "Captain Thompson, I'm General Patricia Williams, Army Aviation Command. What you accomplished today will be studied in flight schools for decades. You saved 500 lives and proved beyond doubt that gender has nothing to do with combat effectiveness." Riley didn't know what to say. To that, compliments felt too big right now, like trying to swallow something she hadn't had time to chew. "I was just flying," she said softly. "That's not all you were doing," Williams replied. The debrief was short. Too many details were still raw, still mixed with adrenaline and exhaustion. The Army would want every flight log, every weapons report, every scrap of telemetry from Apache 77 Alpha. But tonight wasn't about paperwork. It was about the fact that everyone who'd been trapped in that valley was now out of it. When Hayes dismissed her, Riley didn't head straight to her quarters. She found her way to the pilot's lounge instead. The door was open, voices inside. Low, steady conversation, the sound of glasses clinking. The room went quiet when she stepped in. Every head turned. Morrison was there. Collins beside him. They'd been leaning over the table, talking, but now both stood. Riley didn't bother with preamble. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice clear, "I believe you owe me something." For a second, no one spoke. Morrison's face was pale, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped around the table. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About you, about women in combat aviation, about what was possible." He took a breath. "I apologize publicly. You proved today that courage, skill, and determination don't care about gender." Riley held his gaze. "Apology accepted, and the Medal of Honor recommendation?" "Already written," Morrison said. "Already signed." She gave a single nod. That was enough. She didn't stay in the lounge. She didn't have the energy for congratulations, for the mix of admiration and guilt in the room. She stepped back into the corridor, the sound of the storm rushing in again. When she finally made it to her quarters, she didn't turn on the light. She set her helmet on the desk, boots beside the bed, and lay down still in her flight suit for the first time since a 5-4-7 hours that morning. She closed her eyes. The silence wasn't perfect. She could still hear the rain on the roof, the occasional murmur of voices outside, but inside her head, the hum of rotor blades was finally fading. And with it came a thought she hadn't let herself dwell on until now. Tomorrow, someone would look at a woman in a flight suit and not wonder if she belonged there. How do you return to ordinary days after a day like that? Riley found out quickly that you don't. Not really, in the weeks after the mission. Her name traveled faster than she did. It moved through the base, through the Army, through the kind of channel she'd never expected to cross. She'd gone from being that woman pilot to being the subject of formal reports, classified briefings and quiet, astonished conversations between commanders. At first, she tried to avoid it. She stuck to her flight checks, her training schedule, the small rituals that had kept her grounded for years, but it was impossible to ignore the shift. The aircrews who had once second-guessed her now greeted her with a nod that carried weight. Maintenance teams made time for her bird first. Even the skeptical eyes in the briefing room had changed. Not softer, but clearer. The first time. She saw another female pilot walking toward the flight line with her helmet tucked under her arm. She noticed something different. The young woman's posture wasn't defensive, like it had been for Riley when she started. It was open, confident. That mattered more than the headlines. 3 months after the mission, a formal summons arrived. The White House Medal of Honor presentation. It felt strange holding the official letter in her hands. She'd never thought of herself in the same frame as the names that had been awarded that medal. The mission had been about the soldiers on the ground, not about her. And yet, the Army wanted to make it official. Her name in the citation, her actions recorded in the kind of language that turned moments into history. When the day came, Washington was crisp and bright, the kind of clear blue sky that felt almost staged. Her dress uniform was immaculate, every ribbon aligned, every crease sharp. The Rose Garden had been set for ceremony. Rows of chairs, cameras in place, flags standing at attention in the light breeze. She stood beside Santos, who was there in her own dress uniform, the bandage long gone, but the faint scar still tracing her forearm. Neither spoke much before the ceremony. The president's words were polished, deliberate, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty. The phrases rolled on, describing the mission in measured detail. The surface-to-air threats, the damaged aircraft, the repeated extractions under heavy fire. The numbers, 500 soldiers, were stated with precision, but Riley's mind kept drifting back to faces. The sergeant with the bandaged leg, the young private whose rifle was missing its sling, the captain who had covered the LZ until the last possible second before sprinting for the helicopter when the medal was placed around her neck, the ribbon settling against her uniform. There was applause. Cameras clicked. She stood still. The weight of the medal less than she'd expected. The weight of the day far more after the ceremony. People wanted handshakes, photographs, words she didn't feel ready to give. She offered polite thanks, but her eyes kept scanning the crowd for the few faces that mattered. Hayes, Santos, the crew chief who'd kept fueling the Apache without question. Later that afternoon, in a quiet reception room far from the press, General Williams found her again. "You know," Williams said, "this medal will mean one thing for the history books and something else entirely for the next generation of pilots." Riley tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "There's a cadet somewhere who's going to read about this, and the first thing she's going to think isn't, 'That's impossible.' She's going to think, 'I can do that too.'" That thought stayed with her on the flight back to base. Within a week, a formal request came from the Army Aviation School. They wanted her to help develop new training protocols for emergency flight of damaged aircraft. Her techniques from that day, the way she'd flown without a tail, rotor, the adjustments to counter torque, the precision under stress, were going to become part of the curriculum. The letter ended with a line that stopped her cold. "For the first time in our history, female pilots will not need to prove they belong in combat aviation. You have proven it for all of them." She didn't keep that letter framed or pinned to her wall. She folded it carefully and left it in the top drawer of her desk. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder, because the truth was, she hadn't flown that mission to prove anything about herself. She'd flown it because there had been 500 people waiting in that valley, and no one else had been willing to go. The fact that it had changed something bigger, that was just the part she was still learning how to live with. What does it mean to carry a moment for the rest of your life? Riley didn't have an answer, not one she could put into words. The mission lived in her the way certain storms do. Long after the sky is cleared, it came back in flashes. The way the gorge walls seemed to press in as she threaded the Apache through. The sudden burst of light from a missile detonating against a canyon wall. The feel of the controls fighting her hands after the tail rotor was gone. But most of all, it came back in the faces. Some she remembered clearly, mud-streaked eyes, wide, breaths coming in sharp bursts as they jumped into the helicopter. Others were just shapes, silhouettes in the smoke and rain. All of them had climbed aboard believing, for those few seconds, that she was going to get them out alive. That trust, unspoken, absolute, was something she still carried. Life on base slowly settled back into its rhythm, but it wasn't the same rhythm as before. Her name was on walls now. On plaques and after-action reports, her call sign, Guardian Angel, had taken on a life of its own, showing up in places she didn't expect, painted on a maintenance bay door, scribbled in black marker on the inside of a mess hall wall. She didn't ask for it. She didn't try to erase it. She just let it be. Sometimes she'd see Santos across the hangar, laughing with another crew. Her arm healed, but the faint line of the shrapnel wound still there. Other times, she'd spot Morrison watching her from across the flight line, not with the easy arrogance he'd worn before, but with something quieter. Respect, maybe, or recognition. One night, weeks after the ceremony, she found herself alone in the hangar. The Apache was there, its tail section replaced, rotor blades new, glass unbroken. To anyone else, it looked whole again. She knew better. Machines remember, just like people do. Somewhere in its frame, there were still stress lines, tiny scars in the metal from the day it had been asked to do more than it should have. She rested a hand on the cool surface of the fuselage, feeling the hum of silence under her palm. It was strange. The mission had made her name known far beyond the base. Yet she felt no need to tell it herself. The stories others told were enough. Some were exact, some weren't. But all of them carried the same truth. That day, a pilot refused to quit. That was enough. She thought about the word impossible. How many times she'd heard it. How casually people used it when they meant too dangerous or too difficult, or not worth the risk. In the valley, impossible had been a number. 500 soldiers, one helicopter. It had been the red arcs of SAM coverage on the briefing map. It had been the missing tail rotor and the storm rolling in. And yet, there had been a space between impossible and done. That's where she'd flown. Months later, she received a letter from a cadet at the Army Aviation School. The handwriting was neat, the sentences careful. The cadet wrote about being the only woman in her class, about hearing the same jokes and doubts Riley had once heard, about how, before the mission, she'd thought she might quit. The letter ended simply, "Then I read about you. I'm staying." Riley folded the letter and placed it in the same desk drawer as the one from the aviation school. She didn't keep them out to look at every day, but she kept them close enough to know they were there. On a clear morning, not long after, she walked the flight line before dawn, the air still and cold, the first streaks of light just touching the horizon. The hangar doors were open, and the Apache was waiting inside. Fresh from another maintenance cycle, it would fly again, of course, just like she would. Missions would come, some hard, some routine, and one day, another pilot, maybe one of the cadets, maybe someone who hadn't even worn a uniform yet, would be asked to do something that sounded impossible. Maybe they'd remember her story. Maybe they wouldn't, but they would know it could be done. Riley stood there for a long moment, helmet in hand, the smell of fuel and metal in the air. Sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't argue or defend itself. It doesn't explain why it belongs. It simply acts, and that's all she'd done.